The biggest difference I see when it comes to real estate isn't between houses, it's between buyers. And after 15 years of helping people buy and sell right here in Atlanta, I've watched beginners make the same costly mistakes over and over and over, while seasoned buyers consistently play the game differently and win because of it. Beginners think it's about pre-qualifying, picking a house, and making an offer, but seasoned buyers know that it's about strategy, timing, and reading the market in a way that nobody else is even thinking about. Once you see that difference, you'll never approach buying a house the same way ever again. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly what it is that seasoned home buyers do differently than beginners, starting with the very first thing: reading the market. All right, let's jump right into it. So reading the market is a skill, and seasoned homebuyers know that they have to understand what kind of a market they're currently in to custom tailor their whole strategy, from how they're going to search for houses to what kind of offers they're going to make and how they're going to negotiate those offers. It all starts with understanding what kind of a market you're in. Are you in a buyer's market where the buyers are favored in negotiations and sellers are willing to give a lot more? Are you in a seller's market like where we were between 2021 and really 2023, 24 here in Atlanta, where sellers got everything they wanted and more? Buyers were giving their firstborn child sometimes to buy a house. Or are you somewhere in the middle, kind of like where we're transitioning to right now in Atlanta? So all that to say that the seasoned home buyer is going to go out and get information to educate themselves about what's happening, where they're looking to purchase. And make no mistake, real estate is absolutely hyper-local. What's happening on one side of Atlanta is going to be something completely different than what's happening in another part of Atlanta. It's different in the cities. It's different all the way down to zip codes. It can even be different from street to street, neighborhood to neighborhood. So it goes without saying, understanding what kind of a market you're in is important. So months of supply, key metric, but you also want to understand what the total days on market are. How long is it taking for a seller to attract a buyer and put that house under contract? What are the average concessions paid by the seller in the area? What percentage of homes have had a price cut, and what's the list to sales ratio for those? You can also look at a metric like the pending ratio to see how many homes are actually going under contract compared to how many homes are available in a given area. So there's a lot of little points of data that you can use. And where do you get those pieces of information? Well, if you're not already watching my stat videos, that would be a great place to start. But there's a ton of blogs and articles out there where different people talk about the market all the time. You start wide and then you drill down hyper local. And then the realtor that you work with can also get you very specific stats for your local area. So ask them about those stats, understand what those metrics are and what they mean, and how to custom tailor your offer. We're going to talk a little bit more about offers a little bit later in the video, but it's so important to understand what kind of market you're in before you even get started. And that's where a lot of beginners fail to invest enough time. Now, moving on to the next item, it's understanding a neighborhood. And this kind of goes with buyers who get tunnel vision about a very specific house and they fail to look around to see what's happening. So yes, you're definitely looking at environmental factors. A seasoned pro is going to zoom out and see what's happening around a house. But they don't just want to know what's happening around a house right now. They want to know what's happening around that house over the next 5 to 10 years. If they buy this house, how is it going to appreciate? And is that appreciation going to be affected by different things? So if you were to buy it in a certain part of town and then you're finding out that they're opening up a new garbage dump, that might put a damper on what that appreciation is going to look like, right? But if you're in a part of town and they're opening up new infrastructure, they're bringing in a new school, there's a lot of new amenities that are coming in, it's increasing the desirability of that specific area, that's something that would be good to know. Is there a company that's coming to town that's going to bring a ton of jobs and they're going to be located in a certain area, and then those people are going to look for jobs not too far away from there? Chances are home values in that immediate area will appreciate. So information like that is good to know as well. And it's not something that you'll obviously find on Zillow or in the MLS. It takes a more well-rounded approach to figure out what's happening in a given area, oftentimes overlooked by the beginner buyer. Next, we're going to talk about financing, because even seasoned home buyers will use financing to buy houses. Only roughly 1 out of 5 buyers use cash. It's actually a little bit less in the market right now. So financing is always important. And a seasoned homebuyer knows that it's not enough to just get pre-qualified for a loan. As a matter of fact, the best pros don't even get pre-approved. They go through a whole process to become pre-underwritten. Now, what's the difference? When you look at pre-qualification, it's a 5-minute phone call with a lender. They pull your credit, ask you some questions, and then trust that the information that you're giving them is accurate. Now, where a lot of beginners fall short with this process is, especially if you're 1099 and you own your own business, you're not necessarily thinking of all the write-offs you have when it comes to tax time, and the net income you actually declare to the IRS is what a lender is going to use to qualify you. A lot of entrepreneurs and small business owners are thinking, well, gosh, I'm bringing in this amount of gross revenue. So when you're going through the pre-qualification process, that's not generally something that always comes up in that conversation, but it gets discovered a little bit later on as you go through the process. So pre-approval, you're not just having a conversation over the phone. They're not just checking credit. They're going to look at your bank statements, your pay stubs for the last 60 days. You're going to send in your tax returns. They'll be able to see what you actually declared as income to the IRS. And it's generally looked at by somebody at the lender. It's going to be usually a processor or potentially even the loan specialist themselves. They'll go through a desktop underwriting scenario with you, which is software looking at your inputs to decide what you're qualified for and so forth. So there's no question that pre-approval is more powerful than pre-qualification because if I'm being honest, pre-qualification isn't even worth the ink that it's printed on. You want at the very least to be pre-approved. Even better, and what seasoned homebuyer pros know, is that going all the way and being pre-underwritten is almost as good as having a cash offer in your pocket. So when you go through the pre-underwriting process and you get issued that letter, that pre-underwritten letter, that thing is as good as gold. So when a buyer makes an offer on a house, as the agent, I'm having a conversation with the listing agent and I'm positioning my client's offer, the buyer's offer, right? And one of the things that I do that I'm sure a lot of other agents do is when you're completely pre-underwritten, you let the other agent know that you've been through underwriting. And while this isn't a cash offer, it's as close to cash as a finance offer can get because technically, under the right circumstances, you don't even need a financing contingency. Now, there's a time and a place to waive that contingency. We're going to talk about contingencies a little bit later in the video, but it's a calculated risk that could work in your favor. Multiple offers, if there's another cash offer and they're saying, well, we can close in 10 days, guess what? If you're pre-underwritten, you can close in 10 days or less as well with the right lender. What you have to do is during your inspection period, you'd order the appraisal right away. But ultimately, you have the ability to close very quickly because the financing portion is done. They're just waiting on good title and good appraisal. And a cash offer needs to wait on good title anyways. So long as the appraiser can appraise the house and get the report back in time to close, you can close as quick as a cash offer. So there's a lot of reasons why pre-underwriting is so much more powerful than pre-approval. And there's also a reason why seasoned home buyers use them to their advantage. Now, the next thing we're going to look at relates to costs. Specifically, it's more than just looking at the list price and running some numbers through an online calculator, because that's where most people start. But most online calculators will focus on principal and interest. Some of them will also add in taxes and insurance, but you want to be able to work with accurate numbers and take a step back. And that's where the seasoned home buyer does a little bit more homework. They're going to understand principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. They're going to understand what the HOA fees are. And if there's an HOA, they're going to want to see how healthy the HOA is. They're going to look at CC&Rs, the covenants and restriction documents, the bylaws, any amendments, all that kind of stuff. Is the HOA well funded? What its track record is. But you're also going to look at utility costs. You're going to look at the house itself and what the projected carrying costs are for just home maintenance, right? You look at the house, how old's the AC? How old's the roof? How old's the water heater? Are those costs and expenses that you're going to have to bear in the near future? All of those are factors that come into play that a beginner isn't necessarily going to think about because they've never had to replace a roof. Now that's $10,000 to $12,000. They've never had to replace a water heater. That's $2,000 right there. You know, there's an AC system, $8,000 to $12,000. You have a house with multiple systems and they're very old systems. Like all of that starts to add up in price. So It's so important for a beginner buyer to also take that step back and truly understand what's comfortable to them. And sure, you can start with an online calculator. And if you're going to do that, at least use a calculator that's really good. I've got a free set of calculators that I created for the Atlanta market specifically that anybody can use. There's no special sign up. Link to that in the description and the first comment. Feel free to check those out. But for beginner buyers, oftentimes when you're working with a lender, they're going to pre-approve you, pre-underwrite you for certain amounts, and that certain amount might not match your level of comfort for what you want to spend on a monthly basis. So here's a big piece of advice. The seasoned home buyer knows what they want to spend. They're a little further on in their careers. A lender will qualify them for a lot more than what they typically will want to spend on a house because they've established what that monthly payment max is going to be. And they're going to ask the lender, they're going to say, okay, I'm qualified up to $1 million, but I really don't want to spend more than $5,000 a month. What kind of house price-wise should I be shopping for to make sure I don't go over? So as a beginner, that's what you want to do. You want to figure out what's comfortable for you to spend on a house and all of its related expenses, and then make sure that the lender that you choose to work with, and obviously your realtor, understand what your goals are so that they make sure that you're looking in the right price range. I'm working with a first-time homebuyer couple right now. They were qualified to almost $700,000. After crunching their numbers, we sat down and looked at everything, and they're more comfortable up to $5 million. So that's $200,000 less than what they're qualified for on paper, but it makes a world of difference in quality of life. Not doing that leads to being house poor. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is condition. And I just touched on a part of it with roof, AC, and water here, but seasoned home buyers are looking at the whole house. They want to understand what it's going to cost to get into that property long term. Well, first of all, is the house priced in consequence of its condition? Or is it priced too high and now you're going to want to use those items to negotiate a better price since they have to be addressed? So again, we're talking about negotiations here in just a little bit, but where the beginner buyer often fumbles is they get tunnel vision. They're stuck looking at how beautiful the house is. They're looking at the cosmetics and the staging in the house instead of at the house itself. Now, you don't want to buy a money pit, especially as a beginner buyer. You want to take a step back and consider what it's going to cost because it takes a lot to get into a house, with your down payment, closing costs, all of that stuff. It's a lot of initial money up front. Usually you're moving into a bigger house. You're moving in from an apartment or a smaller place into a bigger house, generally speaking. Now you've got to furnish it. Well, that costs money. So you've got all these plans to get a house, which is great, but you don't want to overextend yourself in the sense that you buy a house that just needs a ton of repairs that you're going to constantly have to fix over time. And then every dollar that you bring in goes into maintaining the house. So the seasoned home buyer takes a step back. In addition to the roof, AC, and water heater, they're looking at the siding, the foundation, the garage doors, the windows, the trim around the house, the watershed around the property. Is water getting into the basement or the crawl space? Or if it's slab, you're still wanting to look at where water flows, right? You're looking at all of the different things that could end up costing a lot of money. And you're trying to decide, is the house priced in consequence of these? Do they know and they've priced it low to take into account? I'll tell you right now, most home sellers price houses that need a bunch of work at the same level as houses that have sold that were in tip-top condition. So you got to watch out for stuff like that. Now it's time to talk offers and negotiating and the strategy that comes into play, which is honestly my favorite part. So there's a big difference between a seasoned home buyer and a brand new one and their approach when it comes to this. So what I've seen happen time and time again with newcomers is they'll take a look at a listing on one of the national portals. So let's say hypothetically something's priced at, call it 700,000. The estimated value on that same portal might show 695. They're thinking, well, gosh, I'm going to offer a little bit less, 690, and then I'm going to ask for maybe 5,000 closing. Or you know what? I'm expecting to have to pay my own closing costs because that's where the market's been over the last couple of years. And everybody that I know that just bought a house had to pay their own closing costs. So I'm just going to pay my own closing costs. It'll make me more competitive. And that's kind of a blind offer because one, you have no idea what the seller's motivations are. You didn't consider market dynamics before you made that offer. You just looked at the portals, and the portals don't understand how something is priced or why it's priced that way, or if it's priced too high. It doesn't take into consideration either recent repairs, upgrades, or things that need to be repaired. It doesn't look at seller motivation and the reason why they're selling. So all it's looking at is square footage relative to other homes in the general area. It might not understand that on one side of a certain road, it's a specific school district and you get more per square foot on that side than across the street where the school district isn't performing as well. So those are all reasons why the national portals and those estimated values, they're starting points, but they're not what you should use as solid data to base an offer on. You want to get very specific with comparable sales that your realtor can help you put together. Now, the seasoned home buyer is taking another step back. You notice the trend here is the seasoned home buyer is not rushing into anything. They're going to take a step back and evaluate and decide which way to go. The first thing that they're going to want to understand is seller motivation. Why are they selling? What's their time frame, right? What's important to them? So do they have other offers? What does the competition look like? Just because you get those answers from the listing agent doesn't necessarily mean that that's set in stone. There could be a certain level of posturing. Everyone's playing poker to a certain extent when it comes to activity. See it all the time where listing agents say, oh, I've got 5 people that are considering sending in an offer, but nobody has yet. But hey, any moment we're going to get an offer. So hey, if you're going to send in an offer, make sure it's the best and highest possible offer that you can get us. So that works in the seller's best interest, but it scares a lot of people into submitting those offers. There's a tool. A lot of agents don't know this. Some do, but a lot of agents don't know this, that there's a tool that you can use to check and see what kind of activity a house is having in terms of showing. Now, it doesn't show you the past. It shows you present forward. And if you don't see any showings on a house, it's kind of hard to see that there are offers that are coming in at that point, right? So it's not a house that's getting a ton of activities. Might not be quite as believable that they have 5 incoming offers. But if you happen to see that there's quite a bit of activity on a house, then it's very probable that they do have 1 or more offers, and that's going to change your strategy at that point. So when you find out what's important to the seller, if you're in competition, you're going to align your offer to be the best possible solution to what their problems are. So if a seller needs to close in 21 days and you're getting financing and you need at least 30 days, well, you're not going to be considered for that house. You're asking the seller to close a week after when they need. But if you are pre-underwritten, or if you're cash and you're making this offer and you can accommodate that closing time, more power to you. Does the seller need a lease back period? Now, as the market continues to shift and we get more and more into a balanced market, and in some parts of Atlanta, a buyer's market, a lot of these terms are going to disappear. Notice we're not talking a whole lot about appraisal gaps or waivers, but they still exist. As a matter of fact, we were involved in a multiple offer scenario roughly 2 weeks ago in Johns Creek, and the people who ended up winning the house wasn't us, unfortunately. My clients couldn't go and put a big appraisal gap. They have very limited funds to use to purchase a house, but the winning offer basically waived their appraisal. So if the house doesn't appraise, they're on the hook for covering the entire difference. So down payment, closing costs, and whatever it doesn't appraise for. And they went up way high on price, higher than what I thought that house would appraise for. So appraisal gaps still exist. They're not as frequent. It really depends on what part of town. I'm always going to come back to that. Real estate is super hyper local, which is why it's so important to understand what's happening exactly where you want to buy, so you can customize your strategies to that. Now, if you don't have competition, then your strategy changes completely. Now, the seasoned home buyer at that point still wants to understand what's important to the seller because they're going to seek the win-win. We're not trying to eviscerate the other side and completely ruin them. You want the seller to feel happy and confident in the transaction as well, while doing the most that you possibly can to get them down on price and give you the most concessions possible. So you look for little wins. If you can work with their time frame while still getting what you want, then great. Both parties are getting what they want. And if they're willing to sell you the house at a price that's a win for you, still a win for them, maybe you give and take in a couple of different areas. But it starts with first understanding what's important to them. Now, the next thing we need to talk about is that the deal isn't done until it's done. And that's one of the big differences, I think. When you've been around the block a couple times and you've bought and sold houses before, you know that a lot of different things can happen during a transaction. For a first timer or our beginner buyer, they go under contract and they start celebrating immediately that they just bought a house. Well, you didn't buy that house up until you sign on the papers on closing day. You're dating and you're going through a process to see if you can get married and consummate that sale. But there's a lot that can happen before. We're about to talk about the due diligence period, which is the inspection period, but you've got the appraisal contingency, you've got to finish financing, you got to make sure the seller fulfills their end of the bargain if they agree to repairs, which we're about to talk about. So ultimately, the biggest thing that you can do as a buyer when you're buying a house, and as a seller, it works both ways, is you don't get too high or too low. When you go under contract, that's the first of many milestones that you need to go from your starting point, which is getting under contract, to getting to that closing date. So stay even keeled. Don't get too high or too low. Don't let your emotions get the best of you. So let's talk about inspections, right? Because the way that a first timer or a newer buyer is going to approach them is generally very different than what the pro is going to do, that seasoned home buyer. So the seasoned home buyer knows that the inspection, first of all, is paramount. You always want to know what you're buying. So you're going to invest the $400 to $500 to $600 to get your general inspection done. In some cases, it makes sense to also test for radon, to test sewer line, like on new construction, doing a sewer line test where they scope out the sewer line with a camera to make sure there's no obstructions. Very smart thing to do. And there's a bunch of other inspections that you can get as well, depending on circumstances. You know, if you're buying a house and you smell mold or mildew, might be worth the $395 to have an indoor air quality test to find out if there's mold in the property, right? Because then those reports give you leverage to renegotiate. And that's where there's a big difference between the seasoned buyer and the new buyers. The new buyer sees inspections as a pass-fail. So the report comes back, they get intimidated by what's on there, and they're like, oh gosh, well, seller's never going to want to fix this stuff, let's move on. Or they think that the house is going to fall down. So a couple of pieces of advice. One, first and foremost, attend every single one of your inspections in person, because you want to be able to have a conversation with your home inspector while they're at the house about what they found. If you're working and you can't get out of work, you know, that's part of the worst thing that can happen, because then you have the inspection done, the report comes to you at night, you're looking at that going, oh gosh, like this is horrible. This house is going to fall down tomorrow. There's no context. You're paying your inspector to put every single little thing that was found in there. But if you had a conversation with your inspector, they'd say, look, I'm putting this stuff in here. This really isn't major. They're small rock things. Here are the big rocks you actually need to worry about. Now, with those big rocks, it's not pass fail. If the seller doesn't fix it for you and you cancel the transaction and then it goes under contract with somebody else and they have it inspected again, they're going to find the same stuff. So eventually the seller is going to either have to drop the price, give a concession, or fix those items. So why not do that for you so that you can help the seller and yourself get to the closing table? That's the way that you want to look at it. Now, another point that differentiates the seasoned buyer from the beginner is that the seasoned buyer is going to be open to getting more information. So on the report, the inspector might say that they recommend that you have a specialist come and look at that specific issue, because think of the inspection, the general inspection, as a generalist. That inspector is a generalist, not a specialist. So they're going to recommend in some cases that you have like a structural engineer come out to look at the foundation, right? They might say licensed HVAC contractor or a licensed plumber or a licensed electrician. Some cases, you don't necessarily need those people to come out. You can just stipulate that those items will be fixed before closing. But sometimes these issues are so big that you actually need more information before you decide how to proceed, because sometimes it might not be worth proceeding because you don't, like, there's a lot of reasons why you would cancel at that point. But the seasoned home buyer is going to get more information and then decide how to proceed. So when it's time to negotiate with the seller, all of the inspections that you got, whether it's from the inspector, specialist, maybe you got quotes, because if there's something that needs to be fixed, understanding what it's going to cost, you get a couple different quotes. You show a baseline for what the market price is to fix those. Now you've got some good ammunition to go back and negotiate to see if the seller is willing to work with you to get to a spot that works for you and that still works for the seller. The beginner buyer canceled the contract a long time ago. Now here's another thing. Just because a house might say that it's being sold as is, doesn't necessarily mean that it's being sold as is. So you'll still be able to have your own inspection. I've yet to see a contract that says, no, you're buying it no matter what, there's no inspections. But usually what that means is the seller doesn't want to entertain any repairs. And what that really means when you peel back the layers of the onion is that usually the seller's funds, money, tied up in the equity of the house. It's not liquid. That's the reality for a lot of people. So when you sell it as is, you're saying, hey, we're not going to fix anything. But what that doesn't mean is that you can't go back and say, hey, you were priced here. This was a premium price, but the house is not in premium condition. Here's what we found. Here's what we quoted out. There's a couple of different quotes. You can see what they look like. We're asking you not to fix these items, but to give us a credit in lieu of repairs and or drop the price of the house equal to what these amounts are. So it opens up a different avenue. And very often I've been successful in having those type of concessions done, even when they say that it's as is, because as I mentioned, it's usually a cash flow problem or a cash position problem that's stopping them from wanting to do repairs. Sometimes it's timing, because if the transaction needs to close by a certain date because they're already out of town, they might not have time to get repairs done, but they're willing to give a credit so long as it's fair and there's justification for it. And then the nice thing about that too is, as a buyer, it honestly is in your best interest to be able to choose the provider or vendor that's going to do the repair, as opposed to having the seller pick one, because most sellers are going to go for one path of least resistance. Who can get there the fastest and charge me the least amount of money to do the work? And is it going to be the best quality work? So you don't want to have to, in a situation where you could have gotten credit, chosen the company that you really wanted to do the work. Now you're not getting the credit and the work wasn't done well. And after closing, you're still having to pay to redo that work. So those are some of the differences between beginner mindset and seasoned homebuyer process when it comes to home inspections. Now let's talk appraisals, because as the market shifts a little bit, they're becoming more important in the sense that a couple of years ago, appraisers were a little bit more lenient with how they would assess a property's value. Now they're a lot more careful. And I think that newer buyers don't really understand the ramifications of a low appraisal the same way that a seasoned buyer would. So as a first timer or a newer buyer, generally speaking, you've got limited funds. You might have just enough to cover your down payment, closing costs, because a lot of people still factor in that they're going to have to pay their own closing costs, inspection, appraisal, and moving costs, right? Like that's pretty much everything. What happens if a property appraises for $20,000 less than what you have it under contract for? Well, right off the bat, the seller is going to tell you, well, now you've got to pay the difference, right? But you more than likely have an appraisal contingency that gives you an out. And if the seller won't come down, you can exit the contract and get your earnest money back. But you've already invested all of your inspection money and your appraisal money, and you're having to start over. What if that was your dream house, right? So you want to understand those numbers. You don't want to overextend when you're doing an offer. Where the seasoned home buyer approaches it sometimes just a little bit differently is they have extra cash reserves that they can use in the event of a low appraisal. They fully understand what the numbers of the transaction are going to be. But appraisal isn't the end all be all of price. It's a human being's opinion of value. Granted, they're a certified licensed appraiser, but it's a human being's opinion of value at that point in time. If you're going to live in this house for the next 10 to 20 years, paying an extra $10,000 or $20,000 out of pocket towards your down payment today will more than likely more than be made up over the next 20 years in appreciation. So are you not going to get the house that you absolutely love because of a short appraisal? I mean, I can't answer that for everybody. It really depends on your unique set of circumstances. It's harder for first timers to have those cash reserves, but the more experienced home buyer has them set aside specifically for a rainy day like this. Now, in a perfect world, you're offering on a house that's going to appraise just fine. So it's a moot point if that happens, but just understand that appraisals are becoming more of an issue as we head into a more tumultuous market. Now, this whole process is a marathon. It's not a sprint, and seasoned home buyers know that better than anyone. There are bound to be obstacles and challenges that have to be overcome to get you from your starting point into your dream home. And for newcomers, I think staying even keeled, managing those emotions and expectations so you don't get too high or too low is very, very helpful. What's also helpful is having a strong real estate agent guiding you through this process. But make no mistake, there are things that you should never, ever tell a real estate agent, because if you do, it could potentially cost you thousands. To know what those are, you're definitely going to want to watch this video next.